See, this is the thing about live things, Michelle. And then we have to edit. We can edit that out later, or at least I can attempt to. Anyway,
You
good
can
morning,
try
everyone,
to.
and welcome. I'm really glad that you're here. I'd like to start by acknowledging the lands in which we're meeting today. I'm coming to you from the Yagara and Turrbal lands, and I just want to recognise the traditional owners of Meanjin and Brisbane, where I'm coming live to you from as well, and equally recognise and pay my respect to any elders past, present, and emerging, or those that might be joining the call this morning. My name's David, as you know. There's a few regulars that will be jumping back in again. It's nice to see you again as well too. But today's conversation really feels like an important one. It's one that, um, oh, sorry, some meeting participants cannot hear you. They must have. Oh, okay. Hopefully that's coming through. You can hear me, Michelle. All right, can't you?
I can hear you okay,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
hopefully they can hear
That's
me too.
okay. So everybody should be here, and it just says some people that they need to update their live performance audio. So it's not us. Around things. Anyway, to bring us back, sorry. Today's conversation really feels like an important one. Across the social sector, there's a growing body of research and a lot of commentary around something that we've really been pointing to the same conclusion that burnout is not necessarily an individual experience, but it's something that's being shaped by the way our organizations and systems operate. And I can think of a better person to actually sort of have this conversation with. I'm going to give a big wave and hello and a very late night from Ireland back home. Michelle Reynolds is joining us. Hi, Michelle.
Yes, hi there. Thank you so much for having me. Grateful for the opportunity.
I'm glad that you're able to join us as well. But Michelle's research, Caring Too Much, and other international insights and work that's been happening here in Australia through an organisation called Benefolk, has come up with that consistent messaging around what we're talking about when we talk about burnout and in the social sector itself. Um, what people are sort of what people are asked to do is care really deeply, but sometimes that doesn't always support, or the organizations don't always have the necessary support to themselves in terms of sustaining that level of care. And I think what struck me is this consistent messaging around all the different sources, different countries. This isn't isolated; it's patterned in a way. It's the same that people are saying. Whether the Dorothy Johnson Centre of Philanthropy has written about this, Chronicle of Philanthropy has written about it. All of those resources that I've shared and getting us up to this point today. So, Michelle, I'm really glad that you're here to have this conversation. Before we get into it, I do want to acknowledge, though, much like you've acknowledged in your paper as well, too, Michelle, that this is a topic that may resonate quite personally with a lot of people. We're talking about burnout and pressure and the realities of working within the social sector. So, I encourage anyone that's listening today or listening back as well, too, that if there's anything that comes up during this conversation, to really reach out to that trusted person and have a conversation, or if you need to step away, do so, and also rely on the various professional support services that are around you as well. It's intended to be a thoughtful and respectful conversation, but I appreciate that everyone playing and being a part of it is you know there'll be different experiences that we all have around it as well. So, Michelle, starting with something quite fundamental, burnout's a term that we hear a lot. But from your
Yeah.
research, what is burnout in the context of the social sector, and how is it different from, being tired or under pressure?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think those two things are accurate as well, but I think I'd probably first say that everyone's experience of burnout is different. So people experience that differently. For some people, it comes along really quickly. My experience and the research would suggest that for most of us working in our sector, it's this sort of drip, drip, drip that we're not even aware of until actually maybe it's a little bit too late. I think one of the biggest shifts from the research maybe is understanding burnout as relational and emotional, relational, especially when it comes to fundraising, and emotional as well, rather than just physical, which I think is probably maybe more where a lot of people would have associated burnout more traditionally, and that feeling of being tired, under pressure, as you said, like not able to keep track of all the things, and all of those things are absolutely true. There's a lot of alignment with sort of anxiety symptoms and stuff as well. But I think within our sector in particular, and others too, of course, it's deeper. It's like a more chronic emotional depletion, maybe for lack of a better word.
Mm,
And I think the other thing that came through was that it's not just the workload. So, I think that burnout piece has often been associated, not exclusively so, but we hear it a lot. I think it's,
Mm,
that it's
mm,
almost sometimes lost its meaning, and it's kind of associated with the
mm,
level of work, or you're working really long hours, or there's a lot on your plate and what have you. But it's actually the emotional weight of the work as well, and that's
mm,
obviously across people who are working on the front line. But I think where it's
mm,
sometimes forgotten is for people like us who are working, within the social sector, still in a lot of the time trauma informed
mm.
work that's really emotional, and it's cumulative because it builds over time. We're doing it all the time, so we're in it
Yeah.
every day, and it builds over time through repeated exposure rather than just this, you know, one intense
Mm,
period, And I think
yeah.
there's the other thing in our sector as well is that you know, for the most part, my experience has been that the people who work in this sector and who work in fundraising do it because we love it. Like, we love what we do. Most people are very purpose driven. It gives us a lot of meaning. Um, and then that very thing that gives us meaning becomes a thing that starts
Mm,
to drain us,
mm.
So I think it's often tied to empathy in fundraising. I think responsibility for outcomes and
Yeah.
financial pressures, um, and this sense that if I step back, there could be very real consequences for real people that I might even have met or read stories about, or that kind of piece. Um, so yeah, it's quite loaded, David. I would
Mm,
say, based on the research and on all the feedback that I've had kind of since then.
mm,
It's
mm.
not about I need a break. It's about I don't know how to keep doing this. You know,
Yeah,
and I think it off
it's
you
this sustained level of care. It's this sustained work. I mean,
absolutely.
we can't put ourselves in terms of, not regardless of role, but we can't put ourselves working in the majority of society's wicked problems and think that that's not going to have a comeback. And I think even from Colin sharing his story, and thank you, Colin, for sharing your story and so thoroughly. There's a lot of things that get misunderstood because it shifts burnout from being something that's episodic to something, like you just said, is cumulative as well. And it's important that
Yeah,
it isn't just about having a bad week that week. It's something about the conditions that our people are working within over time that keeps it going. We see it all the time. The emotional reality of the work is something that comes up because you're juggling so many different things. One of the things your research really highlighted was that emotional dimension around things. So I'm
mm,
interested in sort of seeing sort of how you see that playing out. What is the emotional labor that's involved? Working in fundraising, but also then in the social sector. And why do you think it's often why do you think it's often underestimated, in terms of that, you know, why it becomes invisible in some ways? Like, why do we underestimate it?
yeah.
Excuse me.
That word invisible is came through in every interview I did. Not intentionally. So it's really interesting that you brought that in, because I don't even think I've used that word with you yet, David. But yeah, I think there's a few things that come up in that for me. So first of all, what's different in this sector, I believe, is that burnout is tied to values. So
Mm,
it feels like a personal failure rather than, an occupational hazard or like a workload issue. But I think the biggest theme that came out through the research was empathy. That is a trait that is consistently highly present for people who work in fundraising. Fundraising is
mm,
deeply relational. It's about connecting people to causes through
mm,
emotion. I mean, that's how we're, in relationship fundraising, that's how we do what we do. And so fundraisers are constantly translating human suffering into
mm,
stories. And like that process itself has an emotional cost, and we're constantly engaging with, it obviously depends on the cause that we're working in. But for example, grief, trauma, hardship, and then all the different stakeholder groups, because there's donor expectations then as well, and
yep.
meeting the donor where they are. Very often there's an emotional weight to the donor's experience and connecting with them. There's the internal pressure to deliver, and then there's our own pressure to deliver, because we feel like there's very real people at the end of it who will be impacted. And then obviously we have targets on top of that we need to meet. So there's
Course.
kind of a lot. And then there's the emotional labor in managing relationships as well, with the different, like the donors, the sort of gratitude expectation piece, the internal
Mm,
teams, like expectation, pressure, like that kind of alignment piece is there as well. And then obviously with beneficiaries as well, which is where that kind of
mm,
empathy and care piece comes in. And because fundraisers aren't front line, that is where that
mm,
invisibility I think really has come in. Because as a result of that, I think there isn't that same maybe formality or recognition perhaps around the secondary vicarious trauma that could be there, the potential impact that's there. We're
Mm.
not the people who are meeting and working with the people who are impacted or experiencing the services of the organization. And so because we're that one step removed, I think there isn't always that acknowledgement or recognition, or not. I think it does, we have to acknowledge that some of that comes from ignorance, but I think we have a duty of care
Mm.
to inform ourselves and to really consider that. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think the research really highlighted that the
I think
constant kind
it's
of emotional switching.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot to navigate. You're a kaleidoscope of emotion essentially because you're sitting
Yeah,
as a fundraiser, but then also having having had a career myself that's varied, having sat in services, there is that mindset that can come in of people thinking, but they have it worse because they're dealing with, as opposed to you sitting over here going, but you're just dealing with that. So that almost this comparative nature of, and it came out, in the research
100%.
around things, but it's almost like there's the
It
job
did.
description, but then there's the emotional reality of the job, and the two aren't always aligned whenever it's in there. Because, like you've described, when you're sitting in a donor meeting, there's a lot loaded on that. Even now, for me, sitting in medical research that's into cancers, you're navigating something that's there where someone maybe is making a gift or a donation and having that conversation. You're talking about a little bit about the science, but then you're also listening to that person and their reasoning for giving, which could be related to the death of a loved one. In that
Hmm.
context, as well, you could be sitting there dealing with cancer diagnoses within your own family and having those conversations. Where's the debrief after that conversation? Because you're immediately walking from that meeting into your next one, probably, and no one's thought to yourself, hey, are you all right for 2 seconds? Just to sort of
Yeah,
take that down. That's quite a lot of emotional intent, especially when someone, has that heightened emotion as a donor, for example, compared to a young person who's navigating their way through a youth mental health service as well. I
mm,
hear. I think I'd said to you before, but I'd heard a lot from social workers who were like, oh, it comes with the job. And you kind of go, but it doesn't. You need supervision. You need to debrief. You
yeah.
need to be able to take a step back. And that's kind of where Benny folk were looking at that well-being side of things. A lot of people were kind of going, the organizations don't get that in some ways. The system is not supporting it
I
in some
agree.
ways as
Yeah,
well. I
and
think,
the research did I think that's a really valid point as well. I think that because there's that sort of emotional switching that you're kind of as you're talking about there, going from conversation to conversation or meeting to meeting. And I think as a fundraiser we're actually wearing a lot of different hats on any given
yeah,
day. You're kind of moving from compassion to performance to resilience and then back into empathy, and where we kind of have to carry that emotional weight. Like there's no off switch for that. It doesn't just stay in the
no,
office. And yet
yeah,
we also don't name it or support it or acknowledge it. And I am talking generalized. I know that there are organizations that do some
yeah.
really beautiful work around this stuff and really supportive work. But I think it's fair to say that as that the wider experience would be that it's not really acknowledged
Mm,
and named, and therefore it is therefore invisible. Fundraisers are often isolated in that.
mm. So I think one of the papers that I was reading around was talked about this hyper disruption where organizations are operating in that constant state of change, just like you've described, where the job is different every day. There's change, there's uncertainty, there's demand coming at you.
Yeah.
And what that becomes the norm rather than the exception, it raises the question around how sustainable that is, that you touched on there
Mm,
as well. So I'm curious,
yeah.
like how you see that shaping what we're now calling burnout, essentially, and what we're talking about. Why do you think that burnout is becoming more visible? Is it increasing, or are we just getting better at recognizing it? Like, what do you think the change and the shift has been there, or do you think it's shifted enough, even as well? These are the sort of things that run through my mind.
I know. I don't know if I have, an answer to that really. Like, I think it's both, honestly. Like,
Mm,
I do think it's increasing, and I don't think that's necessarily explicit to the fundraising sector. I think the workforce and our expectations around itself and this like immediacy of response and that's come with the advancements in technology and everything as well.
mm,
People's expectations of others and themselves from a work perspective, I think, is higher. Um,
mm,
and I absolutely see that represented in our sector. I do think there is an increase in that burnout because the expectations there are higher to do.
mm,
Let's do more. We have to do more for more people with less money, with less resources, with less support. Um, but I do also think that we're getting better at naming it. Like
Right.
even, you know, David, you reaching out to have this conversation. I mean, I just don't know if that would, not you personally, but I just don't know if these conversations would have happened 5 years ago. Like it was only a few years ago, was it 2024, I think, that we first
Yeah.
presented this research to a room full of people in Ireland. And I mean, it was so much emotion in the room, I think, and we had
Mm.
so many people reach out to us afterwards, sort of saying, finally this is being, this validation of like, okay, I'm not in it on my own. There was teams of people where all of them were looking at each other going, how have we never had this conversation with each other? And all of them were impacted on the day. It was
Mm.
really powerful and kind of distressing and disheartening to be a part of. So I think it's
Yeah, it would
increasing because
be.
demand on charities is growing, where resources are more stretched, expectations are higher. And what I see is that fundraisers are often at the center of that. I think
Yeah.
holding the pressure from all different sides. But then it's more visible because I do think people are starting to speak up. And I think more generally speaking, mental health conversations are becoming more open.
Mm.
That's not just exclusive to burnout at workforce, but I think that's our society is becoming better at naming that and talking about it. But for
Mm.
a long time, it has been, for fundraisers anyway, certainly I think it's been hidden in plain sight. But I think
Mm.
that validation of each other's experiences, that's what I've witnessed over the last couple of years, has been the most powerful transformation for people, was to feel like
Yeah.
they're not alone in it, and for to have others say, oh yeah, I feel that way too. And visibility grows and people realize they're not the only one feeling it.
Yeah.
That's how it
I think
grows.
the pandemic seemed to be a bit of a short circuit for everything, because even just a lot of the information that was a lot of the information and conversation pieces and circulars started to come from that. But at the same time, it's been around for years before that. As you say, that sort of
Yeah.
visibility hasn't been there. I think I became really aware of it whenever you were sitting in a sort of social services context. I mean, we've all I've worked in the sector my whole career, but when you're actually at that intersection of where you've seen people dealing with some really gnarly things, that you just kind of went, where's the debrief here? Where's someone checking out with
Hmm.
them? How are they grounding themselves to leave work on a Friday and leave the cases that are quite traumatic, that they're
Yeah.
handling somewhere else? And it was then that you saw it, and I just kind of thought, yeah, we need to really pull this information out and start talking about it, but also put pressure on organizations. I mean, know the legislation here in Australia started to change that in terms of psychosocial hazards and the sort of proactive approach, but fundraising, as you
That's
say,
really reassuring to hear. I didn't know that, David.
it
That's great
is,
to
yeah.
hear.
So
Yeah.
the guidance around it's been varied though. So I think in some of the local organisations like Benefolk that I mentioned, kind of thing, they've generated a lot of resources, but the question still needs to go from board right down in terms of what is the metric
Yeah.
that they're looking for there. How
Mm,
are they understanding this? How are they holding management accountable for it? Not just
yeah.
beyond the metric of staff turnover or performance or something, but actually, the caring aspect that's in there as well. So I think, like like you've described, the fundraising lens is critical, and it is, sitting in
Mm.
a fundraising seat now, it is that thing of targets versus empathy. But what is it about? What is it, do you think? And you sort of already answered this anyway, like in terms of my question around what is it about the fundraising rules that makes them especially vulnerable to burnout? Thanks,
Yeah.
Andy. Andy's just sharing the link there to Benefolk Foundation.
Thank you. Yeah, I
So
haven't seen
thank you.
that actually, so I really appreciate you sharing that. I mean, I could talk about this piece a lot because sort of the
Go for it.
root
I
of the
mean,
research, I suppose. I mean,
this is the
like
bit. It's all in here.
yeah, that's a much more concise version of the
It's there. It's
25,000 word
there.
dissertation.
But
Um, like I think it's a balance between lots of things, but like I think ultimately fundraisers, I believe, care really, really, really deeply. We, I think, really know why what we're doing matters for other people, and not necessarily just the people our charity serves, but actually for donors as well. And I think that's
mm,
because we really listen. We have to be good at our jobs. And I believe that empathy that I believe we all carry means we have the capacity to genuinely put ourselves in someone else's shoes and understand what that person needs, or what
mm,
their experience is, or maybe why someone might want to give. So we don't just see the money, we kind of see beyond it to what the money can do and how that might feel for people. And like that's the heart of our job really, is to
mm,
deeply listen, to understand someone's grief or pain or suffering or trauma, take all of that in, and then find a way to share that back, that
Mm.
human experience, in such a way that others feel moved and inspired to act. So, how can that not possibly impact us in some way? And I think during my research interviews, as I really began to explore this kind of theme of empathy, which was the loud and clear thing that came through. It wasn't
Mm.
named by people, but it was just so clearly what the experience was. Much of what I got back was this constant message from fundraisers, and you've talked about this already, David, earlier, was that yes, but it's nothing in comparison to what our care workers, the people on the front lines, our families, etc., experience every day. And so, and again, you named this, before I even named it earlier, like there's this the really the really hard trend that for me that I saw coming through was this trend of minimizing our own pain and our own
Mm.
experience in deference to others, um,
Mm.
others before self, almost always. Like that is the way that we show up in the world a lot of the time, until we find ourselves and our boundaries a little bit better. And when I think of people that I know in this sector, what I see are people who are always there for everyone, people who'll drop everything to help someone else, who always say yes, who offer to take on more, who sit working late into the night if it means others won't have to suffer. So I feel like we sit in this really complex position that we're not delivering the service ourselves,
Mm.
and yet we feel responsible for whether the service can exist. So there's this real sense of like, if we don't raise this, something might not happen for someone, or something might
Mm.
happen to someone.
Mm.
And so that creates this real moral weight to the work, like not just a professional one, but like that real, oh my God, I have a real sense of like care and responsibility here. And then
Yeah.
alongside that, there's that combination of obviously the high empathy, but also the high pressure to live financially, this constant urgency, the constant limited resources, the exposure to human suffering, and then obviously, often the lack of maybe understanding or appreciation or validation from others that this is even what the experience is. So you're carrying all those stories of trauma while also
Mm.
being responsible for raising money to respond to that trauma. And if you don't
Mm.
succeed, there's a perceived human consequence. So it's one of the
Mm.
very few roles where emotional connection and financial pressure are completely intertwined. And that
Mm.
when the role, your success in the role feels critical and the failure feels personal. So
Mm.
sorry, there's a lot in that, I know, but
There's
like
a
this,
lot. That's
it
yeah.
was,
There's a lot holding in that. I mean,
yeah,
that's the really tricky part because it's the connection deeply with people's stories, but then you're also delivering very concrete outcomes. In the last conversation,
yeah,
Kate Collins reflected on that an awful lot as a leader sitting in that space, as a CEO, having to think about those conversations, especially when it came to like a service change. To know that you're going to have to close services down to, focus on
yeah.
something else, that emotional labor of making that decision to go, okay, hang on a second, and then we can go into the teleological ethics around this in terms of are we doing good here by changing the service dimension that's going to impact this cohort of people? Yes, because in the greater good sense of things, we're going to move into this space, but to get there, we're going to have a bumpy road. That's a lot to take
Mm,
on. And, she reflected well on
yeah,
having those people that she could have that trusted person to go, I'm checking in with you after this call kind of thing, even just
yeah.
having to furlough people
So
at
important.
different points. It's so important. But a lot of the
Yeah.
traditional conversation is often around a lot of the traditional conversations around this that I've sort of observed. It comes up with how you cope, in some ways, like the system versus the
Hmm.
individual, in some ways. That
Yeah.
we're being seen as that you are resilient, and it is a test of resilience, kind of thing. And what's been striking with a lot of the work and some of the initiatives that's taken place is that it's shaped by systems and expectations, just like you've described as well. But to what extent is burnout an individual responsibility, and to what extent is it something that organizations and the sector need to own themselves? Where do you think that responsibility sits?
So I suppose
Probably across
now
all
that
three, but
I'm
yeah.
not only a fundraiser, I feel like I can speak a little bit less controversially maybe about this now.
Yeah.
I think we have treated burnout as an individual issue for sure,
Mm.
and I don't discount that either. I do think we have an individual responsibility, to look after ourselves and understand what our own personal boundaries are. building that resilience and that self-care and the coping. So, like I'm also a therapist by, a psychotherapist by trade as well. So,
Hmm.
I'm all over this stuff and I believe deeply in it. And I think it's really important. But I would say certainly my research and, it just feels so much bigger than that now because I've had so many conversations since then. I really do think we need to challenge the idea that burnout is about individuals not coping,
Yeah.
because the research and every conversation I've had since then is really, really clear that it is absolutely is systemic issue. And obviously I can only speak, authentically about my experience, my own experience and the experience within my
Hmm.
research. And I suppose probably therefore in Ireland more so. But I suspect, given that we've now done these talks in Australia and the UK and
Hmm.
various other places, that this seems to be something that is resonating across the board.
Oh
Um,
God, totally.
yeah, and
Totally.
I
I
think,
mean, it's the same pattern that's coming out and emerging from every level of the organization. I mean, even,
yeah,
you've touched on CEOs there as well. You're a CEO yourself. There's that balance there of like, what board support are you getting in a CEO role? What support are you getting from peers within your executive team? Like, so like you've described, it's moving that conversation from how do individuals cope to what are we asking of people in the first place, and trying to strike.
exactly. I think you're so right, and there's there are lots of contributing factors from a individual organizational and I would say leadership perspective. And when I say leaders, I say, I don't just mean CEOs and boards. I
Yep.
mean people who are in leadership roles as a general kind of role. But the systemic piece, I mean, I think there are workplace cultures piece. This is piece about minimizing the need for rest by normalizing overwork. And I don't think there's a single sector where that's more right, probably, than the social sector. This kind of do more with less mentality, I think, as well.
Yeah.
The sort of implicit expectation that working, and this actually is probably from society as well as from like leadership and board, maybe even from donors around, if you're working in the charity sector, it means you should always give well above and beyond. Like there's that kind of expectation.
Mhm.
There's the untenable workloads, like we're almost always working under resourced and stretched, often working far beyond capacity. And I will say that is true in my current role as well. So it's not isolated to, to fundraisers. I absolutely appreciate that too.
Mm.
A lot of the time we're doing multiple jobs. The yes people, I think, is one of the phrases that came up a lot in the research actually. And yet it's obviously deeply meaningful work. So it always feels like it's urgent because there are
Mhm.
real life people who are going to be impacted. And so there's this feeling of never being able to switch off because there's always
Mhm.
someone who needs us, and this kind of extraordinary guilt and like pressure and stuff like that that we carry with that, and then the
Mhm.
lack of psychological support structures that are around. And I suppose like when you use the word isolated and kind of invisible, we kind of use those terms a couple of times, and when you
Mhm.
consider that, because that's been echoed in other research as you named yourself, and when you consider those concurrent findings that fundraisers feel unseen and unheard often
Mhm.
within their organization, and yet also feel responsible, to a certain degree anyway, for potentially life altering needs of
Mhm.
other humans. When you consider that, you know, absolutely the need for further practical, psychological, systemic supports and work absolutely has to be there. The societal and systemic ideology that charities and people working within the nonprofit sector should be doing more with less has to change. That social narrative that's there, because I know the report says like sort of caring too much. Obviously, there was, there's something in that, but people don't burn out because they care too much. They burn out because the system relies on them caring too much. You can't self-care your way out of a system that's not designed to sustain you.
Mhm. Mhm. Gosh, that's a good line. In there, it's something that's landing. You can't self-care yourself out of a system that doesn't sustain. I think that brings us
Yeah.
naturally to leadership. I mean, we've touched on this already, in some certain areas, but because if burnout is influenced by systems and expectations, then leadership does play a key role in it. What role, there's an emerging conversation here that and the responsibility that leaders carry. I'm saying this right now, but probably because a lot of the provocations around having identified and assessed psychosocial hazards within your workplace as being part of the key legislation that's come in here in Australia as well. So
Mm.
there's limited guidance. There is guidance, sorry, that's there, but I'm not sure when I sort of observe, and it's just an observation, whether or not that guidance is being taken up as well. Having
Yeah,
attended some, here we have the Australian Institute of Community Directors program, and there is guidance that's available for around how you would sort of identify, assess, and be preventative in terms of some of the psychosocial hazards. But our
okay.
leadership actually taken that up, and are they saying that as what we're talking about to sort of lessen the experience of burnout? What role are those leaders playing in either contributing to or preventing burnout? And I'm conscious, or I'm keen to hear your sort of thoughts around that, because I know from myself I try to model that behavior, but what's your
Love
perspective?
to hear it. Yeah, I love to hear that. I mean, modeling means so much more than we lead by our own behavior and example. I've
Mm,
learned that the hard way sometimes as well. But I think leadership is absolutely central. I think leadership can, and I do truly believe that more often than not, it's unintentionally contributing to burnout. I think most
mm,
people are in this line of work because they love what they do and they're purpose driven. And frankly, most CEOs, potentially boards as well, but certainly people in leadership positions are also overstretched and overworked and, struggling as well. And I think it's really important that we recognize that. And I know Rosemary Keogh, who was with the Irish Realtor Association, she was CEO there for a long time. She
mm,
did a piece of research on CEOs and I think it was in relation to the boards maybe, but actually a huge part of what that came out of that was the invisibility and isolation of CEOs in the nonprofit sector and what that role is
yep.
like. So we know that it's not. I appreciate it's not isolated to fundraisers, but I think where some of those things that sort of come to mind around that are rewarding overwork. Again, it's coming from a good place. Like, wow, you worked really late last year, you lights off night, or you got that project done, which is kind of beyond what we ever would have expected to get done. And we we tend to reward that kind of stuff. We celebrate going above and beyond. This is not exclusive
Mm,
to our sector either, by the way. I think we do that anyway. Not modeling rest or boundaries. So that, to your point around, modeling is so important. But I also think if we were to just dig a little bit deeper, I do think the silence is an issue as well, because I do think we have a responsibility to name it and actually talk proactively about the emotional impact of the work that we're doing. Because if we don't, it sort of inadvertently signals that it's not welcome, even if that actually isn't the case. I feel like we do need to be proactive about it, because leaders are the ones who influence what's prioritized, what's rewarded, like our culture, I suppose, what's safe to talk about, that psychological safety piece. And if we only, like, whether it's true that we only value, income and targets and outputs and stuff, or whether we just, that's just what we're talking about, but we absolutely value the other stuff. If we don't talk about it, then well-being becomes secondary. And if we don't model the boundaries, the openness, the care, I mean, if we
mm,
were able to do that, I think it changes everything, really. So when we can,
mm,
leadership can be really protective of, our team, and that the risk of burnout, by naming the emotional reality of the work and actively creating space for reflection and support. So I think one of the line, like if I remember some of the lines like this around from the research that I read as well, is that I would say what came out of that was the feeling that fundraisers need to be empowered and
mm.
enabled to hold the boundaries. So we aren't always great at even putting boundaries in place. We are certainly not great at holding the boundaries, and I put myself in that bracket as well. I'm really working on it and trying to get better, but it is really hard when you really care about the work that you're doing, and you know that there's an impact there. So, but we need to be empowered and able to do that proactively, and we also need to be empowered to find our own individual comfort level around exposure to others' traumatic experiences, because you know
Mm,
that is very prevalent in the fundraising world, and we forget that sometimes, just because we're not the ones answering the phones or meeting the donors. Like, we are still or the people who are receiving the services, we are still
mm,
exposed to all of those, because it's our job to learn about that in
mm,
order to share it with donors. And I think to resist this, self-imposed a lot of the time, yet, to be honest, also reinforced by leadership and organizations to be always on, and put everyone else's needs
Mhm.
ahead of our own. But at the same time, I think charities also need to be empowered to support their staff without fear of public scrutiny of investment in their people. And I do think that there's a much bigger issue there, still
Mhm.
there, and I see that nearly every day. I mean, the questions around budgets and the having to account for that and how to validate our expenditure on our people, not
Yeah.
just like obviously in salaries and things, but in all the other things as well. I think that piece is still there as well. So I think
Mhm.
leadership plays a really, really important role, absolutely. But I think
Mhm.
it's bigger than that, But I do think as leaders, we have the opportunity to shape how people experience the work. Like culture isn't accidental, it's created. Leadership sets the
Yeah.
tone.
And that's the thing, like a lot of people, again, observations across the board, you will say we have a great culture here, but then push it at what I've seen at two ends of this in some ways that I would add into that conversation part. I've yet to have a donor that has asked that question in terms of how do you look after your staff or how do you fund well-being programs. That's interesting in itself, and I think there's a funders
It is.
sort of commentary
Mm.
in there as well that are they taking that into consideration given that interface and the vicarious trauma that you've talked about in some ways. The other part of that then is even just in terms of in job interviews. So I've seen definitely by a generational change, and again, just observations that people are asking that in interviews, even now recruiting, say for this last recruitment period over this last 2 to 3 years for me in two different roles, depending on the age and where that young person's at. I don't mean to be at age, but they're asking that question. What is your people and culture program at this
Mm.
organization? How do you look after your staff? As opposed to some of them, and I think this is a bit of where that minimization thing that you talked about earlier comes in, because people then who are maybe longer experience in the sector, they don't ask that in some ways, and
No.
it's interesting. It's like, why is
We
that
feel
coming
like
up?
we
And
can't. I'm like, oh my God forbid that I should ask
well,
what you're going to do for
exactly.
me.
Whereas, as you say, it's back to us in any form of leadership position that's in. So I'll make sure to ask that question. This is tough work. What's your self-care practices? How do you look after yourself? What does tapping out look for you as well? And then when they're actually an employee, we
Mm.
would reflect on that, because, like you say, you have to model that behavior. I know the
Yeah.
background of people whenever they're having those conversations. You know that that's going to have resonated with them as well. And it's always that bit of like, call me after the debrief, or I'll call them actually after
Mm.
the debrief, knowing that whether it's come up for them or not, it might do, because this is the thing. If you've got your own grief that you're holding, when someone's had those disclosures, such as a donor conversation that's a driver for why they're giving, you want to make sure that you're debriefing at some point and that you have that trusted person. So, like you've described,
Yeah.
you're taking
Absolutely.
care of an organization of staff, but then you're going to have that trusted person that you can turn to and say, whew, that was a day today. Can I grab you 2 seconds just to run down where I'm at in my own head for 2 seconds? And that's great when that happens and you see leaders
Mm.
doing it. And I've seen leaders do it, and you can almost just go, that's
Mm.
modeling really, really great leadership, because often it gets framed around being strategy and performance, and less so about that different dimension that this brings in, which is the experience of the work itself. And that's something that
Yeah.
sort of comes up. But what is interesting though is there is still a blank and there is still a gap in there. But why do you what have you seen even, you said there's been increasing conversations. It's a bit of a counter to what you've described, where there's been increasing conversations. Why do you think it's still difficult to talk honestly about burnout in the social sector though? Because there's still, even me reaching out to you now, for me to be provoked to do that was because I didn't feel like it was being talked about enough in some ways.
Mm.
So it's kind of like,
Okay.
why do you think it is still difficult? What is that sort of, what is that barrier for people not talking about it? Because it's easy for people whenever they're in the sector sometimes to talk about it, but even just outside of it, like you've described around the board. But yeah, why do you think it's still difficult to talk honestly about it?
There's probably lots of layers to this as well. And when you say social sector, because I actually do think it's not always, while I think it's much better in frontline roles, I actually think it's not always easy to talk about it then as well, because their
Mm,
perceived job is to care for others.
mm,
So there's sometimes a like, okay, but your job
yeah,
is like to care
definitely.
for the other people, and they went into the work, for that. And so again, that piece of like, maybe God, is it okay for me to also want to care for myself in that. But I do think there's generally structurally a huge amount more support around those kind of roles, and required support in a lot of cases, which as it should be. Um, but I think, honestly, I think a lot of it, David, comes back to what you just literally said a few minutes ago there around that minimization piece, because it was such a huge theme, in the research, and it has been such a theme, even to see that day when we did that our initial talk, and we've been several since
Mm.
then, but to see the people, almost just people were floored in the room, but a lot of that came from, oh my God, I feel this way. Like, how is it possible that we haven't had this how have we not talked about it? People were quite, there's a lot of emotion in the room as well.
Mm.
And I think that because we minimize it for ourselves, it's not just other people minimizing it. Like, we minimize it for ourselves, we push it down as well, because we have this constant comparative piece of, maybe not feeling like we're frontline, and I
Mm.
therefore shouldn't be struggling, or don't have the, who am I to struggle when when this is going on,
Mm.
for my colleagues who are working on the services side. I think there's actually an identity piece there, in that it's purpose driven work. People feel
Mm.
really lucky to do it. I know I feel that way, and I certainly would often say that, to vocalize that I feel so, it's really freaking hard sometimes, but I do feel so incredibly fortunate to be able to work in the sector and do the work that I do something that I genuinely love doing. So if
Mm.
that's the case, is it okay that I'm, that my identity is wrapped up in that? Then how dare I then also say, but it's actually really hard, and I'm not coping, and it's too much, and I'm not getting the supports I
Mm.
need. I think there's that
Mm.
element to it as well. Reminds me, a couple of the researchers have said this too, of parenting a little bit, like being a parent. That kind of constant, conflict and how we feel about managing all the things, but I do actually think there's a fear piece as well, because it's minimized, and because it's not really talked about all that much, and because there's these huge expectations, all the things we talked about already. I
Mm.
do feel like there's probably a concern there, whether it's conscious or not, for fundraisers, about not being seen, like maybe being seen as not coping, or not
Mm.
committed, or what's the perception going to be, or like, is that now going to mean that I'm perceived a certain way, and then maybe I'm overlooked for things, or I don't have the same respect with my colleagues, or if I go to look for somewhere else and I have to tell people I experience burnout, which is why
Yep.
the power in people like Colin, like, it's so courageous to come out and share that experience with people. He's not the only one who's done it. I've talked to other people who have
Mm.
too. And we need more of that. We need to, like, own it and say, like, yeah, this is what happens, and this is what
Mm.
happens when you put the right structures in place. So I think that cultural tendency to minimize our own needs, which sort of almost gives permission for the minimization
Mm.
to continue to happen with others. And I do think organizations unintentionally, reinforce that by not
Mm.
creating the space for the conversation, like not being proactive about creating space for the conversations. And so people tend to stay silent, I think, until they
You're
actually
right.
can't anymore, and I don't believe, based on everything I've learned now, since even doing the research, that I don't believe the silence is because people don't feel it. I think it's because still we feel like we can't say it,
Mm.
and there's almost a silent hierarchy almost of suffering, that we put
Yeah.
ourselves at the bottom of. Um, and the
Like it
only
stays
place I see
surface
that
level in
not,
some ways, and it's there
yeah,
by, yeah.
I think
There's a
so. And
risk.
the only place I see that not happening, David, to your point about that peer support, is when we are speaking with other fundraisers. That is
Mm.
when, or CEOs talking to other CEOs. I mean, I literally don't think I would still be in the job I'm in if I didn't have other CEOs and other fundraisers from my, career that I could call on, and, to have just for just a vent or for advice, and have someone just to say, God, this was the experience I had today, or am I doing this right, or is it okay that I feel this way? Like,
Yeah.
honestly, don't think I would still be doing the work I do. So that piece that you shared there earlier about that, having someone to call and making sure that we know that our people have a person to call, is so important as well.
It is. It's one of the things that actually helps, and it certainly helps me. I mean, there's certainly people that I've been fortunate to surround myself with that you can go for different purposes and different reasons. The counsel, almost, the brains trust, the
Yeah.
ones that are in your corner for various things as well. But because I do hear what you're saying, and that it can be the case that the conversation can sometimes stay surface level. And it can
Mm.
focus on the well-being initiatives, or it can focus on individual strategies. But I guess sort of from your research and just your observations around things, what's actually helping? What's beyond the usual advice that's there? Is it a redesign of position descriptions? Is it a redesign of operations and how the system works? Like what do you think is practical and an honest way of actually, you know, helping in some ways?
This is always the part people often ask about this. I'm like, oh, I
What do
don't
you
actually
do?
have the answers though. I don't know what the honest answer is, I know what helps me. I wouldn't say it's
Mm,
foolproof by any stretch of the imagination. I definitely struggle sometimes, even now. I mean, the charity I'm in at the moment is a parental bereavement support charity. It's just such a emotional, and it's such a tough space to work in every day.
mm,
And unlike a lot of other charities where you have these beautiful moments of joy and like, oh wow, look at that magic that we've created, like as part of what we've done. Like that it's different. Like the profound impact is there, but it's experienced
mm.
very differently because the worst possible thing has already happened to these families. So
Yeah.
so I think the emotional weight of the work that I'm doing, I don't think I've ever felt it as heavily as the work that I'm in at the moment. And yet I'm probably more resourced because I'm now trained as a psychotherapist as well. Um, I think some anecdotes maybe that might be helpful, like from an individual level. Um, and I say this sort of in acknowledgement that this is not my strong suit, but understanding emotional boundaries, like what is mine to actually carry and what isn't, and being able to stay a boundaried around that. That piece I'm probably better at. What I'm maybe not so good at, and where I think some of us struggle, is boundaries around, someone sharing something with you and it taking you into maybe something of your own experience, or you know not being able to sort of maybe disassociate yourself from that fact that that person, Aya, could be responsible for that person in the work that I'm doing. And therefore, I am now responsible for working even harder or raising even more money or going and meeting a donor,
Yeah.
outside of my work patterns. So the boundaries thing is really important. I think
But even
we
just delivering training on boundaries and what that means, that's almost
100%.
that's a system thing as opposed to individual,
Yeah.
because you can start to sort of see that. The first boundary training I had was eye-opening to kind of go, oh, right, okay, this is what this is about. This is actually going to try
Yeah.
and ring fence my mindset in terms of what I think I'm doing or not doing or practicing. So individually, I'll show up by exercise or something that's making me grounded in the work in the space, but then to actually hear from leadership or superiors or just people that have been brought in by the organization to say this is training in boundaries and how to identify them.
Yeah.
That's a workplace design thing that
It is,
helps.
and there's
You
another
know,
level to that. It's one thing to know how to do it. There's another thing entirely to be able to carry that through, obviously, and
the
that there's a
truth.
lot of work on yourself to get there, probably too. But yeah, I do
A
think
lot of
that
reflection.
a lot of reflection.
There's a
But
lot
I
of
think that's a
reflection.
really good point, David. I think it should be a part of our training as fundraisers is like understanding those emotional boundaries, um, developing awareness of early signs of overwhelm, and then for us to build in individually for ourselves, but
Mhm.
also maybe at an organizational level, spaces to process, not just push
Mhm.
through. Like, and as an organizational level, more proactive rather than reactive supports. It's too late if we're reacting to someone beginning to show signs of burnout. It's too late then. Like we
Yeah.
haven't done the work that we needed to do. I think normalizing the use of supports as well. So it's
Yep.
great to say, oh, we have an EAP program or whatever it is, and it's wonderful that those opportunities are there for people. But if we don't talk about them all the time, or share experiences of them rather than just offering them, then people actually forget about it. A lot of people don't even know that their organization has that because it's not even
Mhm.
vocalized. So I think
Mhm.
that embedding of well-being into everyday culture rather than just individual initiatives. But I think, and I think our conversation really, really highlighted this today, the
Mhm.
importance more than anything else of psychological safety, that peer connection, that feeling seen and valued, and having your role, genuinely feeling that your role is understood. Because I do think that's another layer to fundraising that, particularly boards, don't always really understand what it takes to do fundraising, how long it takes, what, that age old tale of, oh, we'll get a new fundraiser in, and like how quickly will they be able to turn around money, and all the fundraisers, their hearts are sinking, like it takes time to,
Yeah,
to
exactly.
build relationships and do this job well. So I think
Yeah,
that support needs to be built into the system rather than offered when someone is at breaking point. And I think often what helps most is, really is not one big intervention. It's like
yeah,
the consistent small signals that you matter, that your well-being matters, that you are important, and we value you and we care about you as a human being, not just as a fundraiser who brings in money. And we want to
brilliant.
do everything we can to support you in whatever way that looks to
Yeah.
you, which might be different for different people.
Exactly. I think that, and it, comes back to the, I mean, it comes back to the modeling again, because as leaders, we have a behavior to model there as well. I find doing that, myself as well too, almost makes regular the conversation in terms of checking in conversations, but equally, where there's been people that I've had the joy of working with, who then have felt safe to come and say, this isn't a good day today at 2 p.m. in the
Yeah.
afternoon. It's just like, go home. What are you doing when you go home? And then I'm going to check in. The boundary part is I'm going to check in with you at sort of 5:30 if that's agreeable, to you, kind of thing. Just make sure that everything's well, but go home. You don't need to be here. You can't keep going. That meeting can be moved, postponed. You've got to do that, because that's for
Mm.
me very, very crucial, and equally for self as well too. I mean, I know that there's that old saying of, you got to put your own mask on first before you put somebody else's on, and it's so
Hmm.
clear when you're in this work as well. And I've even modeled this
Yeah.
recently myself within my own team members, just to simply say to my senior managers, there's a lot coming up for me today. I've just had two conversations, one after the other, and equally just with everything that was happening in the personal life context, I'm just like, I'm tapping out, guys. I'll see you tomorrow. They see that then as kind of going, "Ugh, he's tapping out," not in a way of holy shit, he's tapping out, but in a
Yeah.
way
A
of like
hundred
he's
percent.
modeling going, he's human, after all,
100%.
kind of
Yeah.
thing, and then
So
back in it
powerful,
going
David.
and
Yeah.
acknowledging that patience as well too. So, that's a
Yeah.
crucial thing, and that's a real trust building exercise with teams, as well, I think, which is really crucial. I'm conscious that we're
Yeah.
getting to time, and I can see questions coming in for different things, because I often want to sort of reflect about. I think you've given us a lot of your learnings at this stage as well too, but I'm going to sort of not close, sorry, go over to the chat, because I can see, oh, good Lord, look at the questions in here. And Aaron's going to town around things. Firstly, just the top, Michelle, and we've Wendy Skiff here, just major alert in what you're saying that seems to have been missed by a lot of organisations. So thanks for highlighting that. Mandatory psychosocial health regulations now apply to all our non-profits here in Australia. It's vital that
Mm.
boards and CEOs are doing risk assessments, updating policies, tempering burnout-driven turnover, and even more. It's even more
Okay.
specific in some states here as well too in Australia, which is 100% right.
That's
So
amazing.
it's a
Yeah.
really great that we're modeling this as a country as well, and hopefully this
Absolutely.
comes on
That's
to the
very
agenda.
progressive, I would say, comparatively to what I hear maybe in other places.
Yeah,
So,
it's.
yeah.
I think that's a bit of difference even just from UK Ireland kind of thing that I'm hearing coming through as well. And what I'd love to then see us as a country then doing is that this information is coming in to master classes at conferences, and it's back to regularizing this conversation around things that whilst it's mandatory and legislated for, that's one thing. We can't keep it between being mandatory and legislated for and then individual. That we need to start talking about how that system has showed up, as well. Aaron's got another question in here for context: martyrdom reward system. Apologizing for being a bit late. Love to hear your thoughts on the martyrdom reward system. The sector historically praises going that extra mile. We did cover
Yeah.
that, Aaron, before. Treating burnout as individual failings, and funder pressure. Leadership is often caught in a squeeze between funders who demand low overhead costs, and the reality of what it costs to pay for support staff as well too. And again, here in
Yeah.
Australia, there's been a lot. I know that they've been over in the UK talking about this, but there's a whole reframe overheads conversation that's been going on in Australia here, Michelle, as well, which is looking at that.
Okay.
It costs the whole. What's the cost of the whole organisation? So that funders are stepping into that space to actually talk about this more. Aaron, I'm not going to have time for all of your question in there. I can see it's quite long. I'm just getting down to the part of Rob has said, great conversation. So refreshing to hear this happening. Can we have access to this webinar so as we can share the super important message? Of course, yes, this will be uploaded to the YouTube channel and be shared around, not only with guests here, but it'll be online then as well, Rob, so you'll be able to see that. Yvonne has asked the question, did the research come up with anything about increased leave taken due to burnout? Was that something that came through?
Yeah, not I mean not specifically, but I will say that wasn't a focus of it. So there wasn't any a quantitative element to it. So we didn't look at that specifically.
Right.
But we do. I mean, I think charities often do have a high rate of leave. It's just ironically, I suspect what we would find is that fundraisers tend to not be the ones taking that sick leave or that other leave. And actually,
Yep.
one of the just anecdotally, if it's helpful to hear, we did this before I actually released any of this research or finished it all. We did this kind of open space session on mental health and fundraising in one of our conferences, and a bunch of people. It was really incredible, and a couple of people in the room were talking about having had to take leave because of just feeling, they didn't necessarily use the word burnout, but near burnout or really, really struggling. And
Mm.
only one person in the room had actually named it as stress leave. Everyone else had pretended it was another kind of sick leave or taken annual leave or taken, unpaid
Mm.
leave. There was people were very reluctant to name it as stress or,
Mm.
emotional support leave. Yeah.
Or change around things as well. I think it's
Yeah.
back to that fear of judgment. As soon as you say anxiety or
Yep.
stress or work-related stress, people start that fear of judgment of going, oh, they can't cope.
They do.
Kind of thing. It's back to them, back to the end of it, not saying, oh, why is this? Why does it happen? Back to that system part as well. Jane's made a comment there. Get this truly normalized in Australia, we need to get the FIA talking about it and Fundraising Institute for Australasia talking about it and building sessions into conferences and training. Couldn't agree more. Michelle's actually spoken and presented this at the FIA, I believe. I think I wasn't at that session,
We
but I
did a
remember
webinar, yeah,
Lucy did a
last year.
webinar on it
Yeah.
as well. So any FIA
Yeah.
members that are on the call, I'm sure that you'll be able to access that from the archives as well. But I totally agree. I think if we keep talking about it, we keep having these conversations, especially like what you've already experienced, Michelle, bringing it into the room, everyone starts to go, that's me, that's the organization I work for. But
Hmm.
also, I think good examples in here, not saying that it's bad examples. I don't mean to counter that by saying good examples, but healthy examples of where workplaces have identified it as an issue and then
Yeah.
moved the system, redesigned the workplace, redesigned the performance measures, redesigned, their leadership context. That's the bit that I think, I would love to sort of see us actually having a bit of a masterclass around as well, because we need to get there. Um, we're at the end of our time together. How quickly an hour goes,
Yeah.
Michelle. Thank you so, so much. I'm conscious we're talking about burnout and it's nearly 11:30 at night in Ireland for joining us. So I hope that you have
I know
like
I
a,
feel weirdly
a,
energized now as well. I was so tired coming
it's
on. I'm like,
like
well, now I
you're
feel really
super pumped
energized
and
and I'm probably
you're
not going to be able to sleep.
I'm ready for bed. But there's been something powerful naming about what many people have been experiencing that we don't always have the space to talk about. So I've really cherished the conversation from that perspective as well. And I think just coming back to where we started, it's important that the conversation can be a personal one for people as well too. So again, anyone
Yeah.
listening back, where things have felt a bit close to home around things, I do encourage you to reach out to that trusted person. Everyone needs one. We should have one. Everyone needs one and has one. Or any of the professional support services that you know of in whatever country you're in, because we've varied countries that have joined us today as well. But thank you for having this conversation. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Really, really great. And as Wendy says in her comment there, one of the most critical topics for impact in our sector to continue. So long may we keep having this conversation. These
Yeah.
conversations matter, but so does how we hold them as well. And it's been a pleasure, Michelle, to do it with you. Thank you so, so much.
Yeah,
Have a
likewise.
great
I'm
rest
so
of your
grateful.
evening.
Thank you.
Good night, etc.
Yeah.
Get tucked in to bed. And thank you,
Thank you
everybody
so
else,
much.
for joining us. Really appreciate the time together. I hope you all have a great day wherever you are in the world, as well. Chat soon.
All right. Thanks so much.